Well, welcome. I want to say thanks to all of you for coming. It's a small group of us, but I appreciate you being here. This is Faith Film Philosophy 2025. Faith Film Philosophy is an initiative of the Gonzaga Faith and Reason Institute. The Faith and Reason Institute is an organization on the Gonzaga campus that promotes faith-reason integration, especially as it's found in the Catholic intellectual tradition, addressing questions like the integration of faith and science and theistic arguments and suffering and the problem of evil and so forth. But we also address the question of the relationship between Christianity and popular culture, and that's really what's behind Faith Film Philosophy. Faith Film Philosophy, the Gonzaga Faith and Reason Institute is supported by generous benefaction of people who wanted to honor our former president, Father Robert Spitzer, and who is an important figure in advocating for an integrationist view of the relationship between faith and reason. So we're very appreciative of that. Faith Film Philosophy is a series. We're actually almost halfway through. We started this year with a faculty panel on Monday night, and then last night we had a student panel, and then we have speakers tonight, tomorrow night, and Friday night, and I hope you'll come back and bring a friend with you. Tomorrow night we'll hear from Tom Hibbs of Baylor University discussing the film Blue by Krzysztof Kozlowski and its relationship to the theory of self that we find in Charles Taylor. And then on Friday, Vern Cisney, who's here in the back, is going to be addressing nihilism in David Fincher's Seven. So we have really, I think, a banquet of interesting things to hear and discuss. Our speaker tonight is going to be addressing the self in the films of Christopher Nolan. Joel Mayward is Assistant Professor of Christian Ministries, Theology, and the Arts at George Fox University. His areas of academic and teaching expertise include Christian ministry leadership, theological aesthetics, contextual theology, theology and philosophy in film, liberation theologies, continental philosophical theology, and the spiritual formation of youth and young adults. In addition to books on church ministry, Joel is the author of the Dardenne Brothers Cinematic Parables, Integrating Theology, Philosophy, and Film. You can tell from the title why I would want Joel to come talk in a Faith Film Philosophy series. Let me say that again. The Dardenne Brothers Cinematic Parables, Integrating Theology, Philosophy, and Film. That was published in 2022. And the forthcoming, we keep waiting for, it's about to be dropped, Cinematic Transcendence, Theology in the Films of Christopher Nolan. So it really literally is about to be published, right? So, and we're, next week now. We keep waiting, but, and that's, so that is 2025. For several years, Joel has been a professional freelance film critic as a member of the Online Film Critics Society and a tomatometer approved critic for Rotten Tomatoes. He has a number of film reviews that you can find on cinemayward.com if you take a look. So lots of stuff to think about to give you some ideas about how to read films critically. But tonight we're going to hear from Joel speak. We're going to hear Joel speak on Now Where Was I? The Incapable Self in the Films of Christopher Nolan. Let's welcome Joel.
Thank you so much. I'm going to transfer the image. I think I can do it. Let's see if I can do it.
Technology's grand. There we go. Perfect.
Wonderful. Well, in conclusion, I've sought to demonstrate how both Christopher Nolan and Paul Ricoeur make claims about human finitude as being dialectically between two infinitudes, God and evil in theological terms, and transcendence and nothingness in strictly philosophical terms. As finite time-bound beings, humans are incapable of taking on a fully objective perspective of historical events. And despite Leonard's claims that he is committed to simply following the facts, Ricoeur contends that all memories and archival history must be subjectively interpreted by imperfect persons. So it's hermeneutics all the way down. Yet this does not mean that we can never truly know events of the past or that our present actions are meaningless. Both Nolan and Ricoeur suggest a kind of skeptical yet hopeful anthropology, one where human beings are prone to fallibility and delusion, with Leonard in Memento serving as a prime example of this nature, yet nevertheless are also capable of understanding and making sense of the world precisely because we have a God-given memory. The very manner in which Nolan edits and constructs Memento, not to mention the rest of his films, suggests an underlying assumption that we as the audience are actually capable of successfully navigating the complex narrative structure that Nolan has presented. So even as Leonard cannot make sense of himself or his world due to his lack of memory, we can make sense of the film and hopefully this presentation precisely through the power of our own memory. Our memory-making capability is aided by the cinematic apparatus, so even as the camera provides us with a subjective view of Leonard's interiority, the camera also provides a transcendent objective view, which provides the capable audience the film's narrative pieces, which we then put together through our own memories. So likewise for Ricoeur, we are most aware of our humanity precisely when we transcend it and interpret it via our memory and imagination. Our awareness of our finitude is evidence that finitude is only part of our ontological being for Ricoeur, that we have some capacity or awareness to go beyond, to transcend our very selves, and thus participate in that capital T transcendence, whether we recognize this to be a personal God or not. So ultimately, I think that Nolan is making a similar claim as Ricoeur about human beings through the medium of cinema. So just as Leonard in Memento practices both self-deception and ingenuity, so too can human audiences become lost in the labyrinth of Nolan's narratives, as well as make intelligent interpretations of these elliptical stories precisely because we are remembering beings. So this is a hopeful anthropology, in that Nolan has both hope in his audience and even maybe possible hope for Leonard at the end of his film. And as St. Augustine suggests in Confessions, our imperfect memories ultimately find their origin and telos in the perfect memory of an all-knowing God. So thus, Nolan's Memento and the rest of his films may be considered works of post-secular cinematic theological anthropology. Part 4. Though much more can be said about the broader narrative and its various interpretations, I want to highlight 3 scenes in Memento, which I find to be keystones for appreciating the philosophical and theological concerns implicit in Nolan's cinema. So the first is a seemingly mundane moment in an early black and white scene, which is an objective scene in the film, where Leonard describes the feeling of waking up in a motel room with memory loss. Just some anonymous motel room, won't tell you anything, nothing in the drawers, but you look anyway. Nothing except the Gideon Bible, which I, of course, read religiously. Here we see one of the only explicitly religious artifacts in all of Nolan's cinema, a Bible. So why a Gideon Bible? Amidst Leonard's transient life, the Gideon Bible in the motel drawer is something consistent and reliable. The Gideon Bible was there before his memory-altering trauma, and it will be there afterwards as well. And that it's a religious artifact which serves as a kind of anchor in objective reality is not insignificant. Nolan seems to suggest a kind of faith that Leonard has here, if not in God, then at least in this particular religious text's ongoing presence in motel drawers. And in a later scene in color, which you see on the screen, a subjective scene, Leonard will again wake up in a motel room and repeat the same voiceover and behaviors until he opens the drawer to find not only a Gideon Bible, but a gun. And these 2 scenes seem to metaphorically suggest that as much as fallible humans can count on objective truth as symbolized by a religious tradition, we can also count on the subjective realities of human enacted suffering and evil. That is, the transcendent is mysteriously and consistently present in our everyday experiences, but it's easy to forget this or to overlook this transcendence due to our fallible human tendencies. Nolan is making us aware of the possibility of transcendence, while at the very same time interrogating the accessibility of that very transcendence. That human beings are located somewhere in the middle between transcendence and nothingness, between the Gideon Bible and the gun. Second, there's a midpoint scene in Natalie's house where Leonard wonders aloud to himself at night about his condition. Natalie has her head on Leonard's bare chest as he lies on top of the bed covers. And he's speaking mainly to himself, but she opens her eyes, suggesting that she's listening to this confession. He says this, "I know I can't have her back, but I want to be able to let her go. I don't want to wake up every morning thinking she's still here, then realizing she's not. I want time to pass, but it won't. How can I heal if I can't feel time?" Leonard then bends around to see if Natalie is awake, and she closes her eyes, pretending to be asleep. Leonard gets out of bed and wanders Natalie's house before noticing the picture of her and Jimmy. And on his Polaroid picture of Natalie, Leonard writes, "She has also lost someone. She will help you out of pity." The dark twist behind this moment is that Leonard is the killer of Natalie's someone, a reality she probably suspects, but to which he remains wholly unaware. And viewing this confession of Leonard's through Ricoeur and Augustine, what Leonard experiences through anterograde amnesia is not simply a loss of memory, but a loss of self. He remains time-bound, but without the capacity to narrate his experiences, and thus is incapable of not only access to the world around him, but also to self-understanding. And so consider what Teddy tells Leonard right before Leonard shoots him in the head at the beginning, or really the chronological ending of the film. As Leonard declares, "I'm Leonard Shelby, I'm from San Francisco." And then he's interrupted by Teddy, who says, "That's who you were. You don't know who you are." And even as he closes his eyes in the final scene of the film and asks whether the world still exists outside his own mind, Leonard has no objective eternal perspective which he can trust, precisely because his time-bound faculty for understanding himself and understanding a transcendent eternal knower, i.e. God, is irreparably broken. So for Ricoeur, Augustine, and Nolan, our memory and ourselves are phenomenologically intertwined. We interpret ourself via our memory of that very self. And Leonard's interpreter, or his memory, is faulty. So once again, Nolan places us as the audience in the role of this transcendent viewer via the camera. We can see and understand Nolan's loss of self, even as we also have to work to interpret and discern what that loss entails due to Nolan's fractured storyline, as well as the ambiguity left in the film's coda. Which brings us to the Memento's ending. So beyond the conundrum of whether or not we as the audience ought to believe Leonard's account or Teddy's account, there is an enigmatic scene, which I've shown on the screen, which I have yet to see fully explained. So following Teddy's revelations to Leonard about how Leonard already killed John G., how his wife survived the attack and was diabetic, and how Leonard lies to himself to continue this cycle of violence in order to give his life purpose, Leonard drives away the stolen Jaguar as we hear the following voiceover. "I have to believe in the world outside my own mind. I have to believe that my actions still have meaning even if I can't remember them. I have to believe that when my eyes are closed, the world's still there." Do I believe the world's still there? Is it still out there? And as we hear Leonard's confession of his longing to believe in an objective exterior world, there is this brief shot of Leonard lying on a bed with his wife with the words, "I've done it," tattooed prominently on his chest. So why is this scene here and shown in this particular way? The scene is aesthetically presented by Nolan as a memory, in the same way that the cross-cutting and flashback technique has been used before, but this memory is an impossible reality. How can Leonard remember being reunited with his dead wife and having enacted his revenge? So two possible interpretations. Number one, this is Leonard's imagination, and it's not a true memory at all, meaning that Leonard has fallen into the pitfalls that are described by Paul Ricoeur regarding memory, where memories and fantasies blur together. Or number two, this is an eschatological vision, a true memory but of a potential future, one which is only made possible through a transcendent eternal vision. In other words, this is a vision of an afterlife reunion, perhaps a glimpse of Leonard's view of heaven, made possible through the God's eye view of the cinematic apparatus itself. So this is a future eschatological memory, a hopeful view of reunion and redemption. There's a fairly different eschatology that's presented in Jonathan Nolan's story Memento Mori, which the film is based off of, where everybody is waiting for Judgment Day, but they don't recognize that it's already happened. They're already stuck in the apocalypse, dead already, wandering around long after the gods have stopped keeping score. So there's a clear distinction between Jonathan's pretty pessimistic Memento Mori, remember you will die, and Christopher's just Memento, or remember. Jonathan's short story expresses a very despairing worldview where nothing matters and we're essentially dead already. But Christopher's screenplay is a bit more hopeful in its perspective on human existence. And so following the vision of his wife as Leonard opens his eyes, he mentally answers the still lingering question about the world's objectivity. Yeah, the world is still there. Eyes fully open, Leonard continues. We all need mirrors to remind ourselves of who we are, and I'm no different. Leonard's perspective evokes the Apostle Paul's words. For now we see only a reflection as in a mirror, then we shall see face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I am fully known. Throughout Memento, Nolan assumes this transcendent viewer who won't forget, because the events are captured by the camera's ostensibly objective eye. Here's how Todd McGowan puts it in his psychoanalytic reading of Memento. Quote, Leonard continues his pursuit of his wife's killer because he believes that the act of vengeance will be registered somewhere by someone, even if no one but him sees it and even if he can't remember it. He, Leonard, implicitly believes in an other, capital O, God, some faceless authority, society as such, the natural world, as the source for justice and justification. So, where McGowan sees this belief in a possible transcendent other as a pitfall of the film, my Ricoeurian interpretation takes a pretty different view that such belief can actually be a source of liberation and hope. And this bears resonance with Augustine's anthropology as well. The human soul as memory, intellect, and will finds its ultimate perfection in God, this uniting of the temporal and the eternal, of our memories found in the memory of God. So Nolan's camera functions kind of like this transcendent other, an objective witness which allows us as the audience to get the true God's eye view of Leonard. So Memento's screenplay provides an insight here. In the final scene of Leonard's affirmation of the external world, Nolan writes this, and this is just in the screenplay, not in the film itself. He opens his eyes, straightening up in the car, breathing. His eyes dart from the strip malls to the gas stations, as if he's trying to absorb the whole town in a single viewing. So Leonard is trying to see the whole, to take on this objective point of view of the world, to see what he calls the facts outside of his own mind. But the key word here is he's trying, because Nolan recognizes the impossibility of such objectivity for a fallible human being like Leonard, whose memory is damaged and whose will is driven by vengeance. But he's still trying. There's some sort of capability that he has as a human being, a kind of faith in the transcendent or in the objective, in the other. So when Leonard's voiceover narrates the final line of the film of "Now, where was I?" it can be understood as a kind of post-secular prayer, in this deeply human question attempting to locate his identity and his memory in time. He's simultaneously turning inward and outward, seeking a source for his self in both the immanence of his interiority and the transcendence that he intuits is out there in the real world. Part 3. So where are you? These are the first words we hear from Memento's anti-hero protagonist Leonard Shelby, who's portrayed by Guy Pearce, a former insurance investigator who suffers from anterior-grade amnesia due to an injury he sustained from a home burglary. The last thing Leonard can remember is his wife dying, a victim of the same violent incident which left him with memory loss. In his quest for vengeance against his wife's murder, Leonard is helped by various characters who embody familiar film noir tropes. So John Teddy Gamble, played by Joe Pantoliano, is this kind of Weasley undercover police officer with corrupt motives. Natalie, played by Carrie-Anne Moss, is the femme fatale who is rightly suspicious of Leonard's car after her criminal boyfriend Jimmy goes missing. And then there's Bert, played by Mark Boone Jr., who's a supporting character who runs the front desk for the grungy motel where Leonard is holed up and repeatedly rips Leonard off due to his disability. So all these characters actually manipulate Leonard for their own gain and use his disability for their advantage by misdirecting Leonard on his quest. And the various Los Angeles locations also exemplify these kind of neo-noir characteristics. Leonard's sparse urban world is made up of motel rooms and diners and bars, traffic-filled streets and parking lots and abandoned buildings, all these kind of liminal spaces. He has no home. He has no place where he exists. He's always in this liminal in-between space somewhere in Los Angeles. Also key to Leonard's self-understanding is Sammy Jenkins, played by Stephen Tobolowsky, a person Leonard remembers or imagines from his insurance days who also suffered from the same condition of memory loss. So Leonard tells Sammy's story in black and white sequences to a phone caller, as well as to us, the film audience, with the film showing us Sammy's tragic tale. So in Leonard's telling of the story, Sammy Jenkins had a wife with diabetes, played by Harriet Sanson Harris, who, following Leonard's conclusion that Sammy's condition is merely psychological and he should have the physical capability to make new memories, gives her husband the ultimate test. She repeatedly asks Sammy to administer her insulin shots at close intervals in the hopes that he would remember having recently given her a shot or admit that he's just faking his condition and avoid giving her a fatal overdose. But Sammy faithfully administers each injection, resulting in his wife's death and ultimately in his institutionalization. So remember Sammy Jenkins is tattooed on Leonard's left hand as a permanent reminder that Sammy's story is not only a way for Leonard to explain his condition to others, it also informs him of his own narrative identity as someone with anterograde amnesia who has tragically lost a spouse. But as we discover over the course of the film, the stories and memories of Leonard and Sammy are blurred together in Leonard's imagination, most strongly signaled by a very brief shot of Leonard sitting in the place of Sammy during one of the black and white flashback sequences depicting Sammy's life, suggesting to the audience that Leonard actually is Sammy somehow. Adding to this interpretation is Teddy's account that's revealed at the end of the film. He tells Leonard that Sammy Jenkins never had a wife, let alone a wife who had diabetes. It was Leonard's wife who was diabetic, and she actually survived the assault. She didn't believe Leonard's condition, and Leonard was the one who administered the fatal dose of insulin to his diabetic wife. Leonard tells Teddy, "That's Sammy, not me. I told you all about Sammy." And Teddy retorts, "Yeah, right, like you tell yourself over and over again, conditioning yourself to remember, learning through repetition." And upon hearing this revelation, we get a shot of Leonard's interiority. We see Leonard's wife sitting on the edge of the bed as Leonard administers an insulin shot to her thigh with a syringe. Then Leonard shakes his head of the image, declaring aloud, "My wife wasn't diabetic." "You sure?" Teddy asks. And the same shot appears with Leonard's wife on the bed, only now Leonard is just playfully pinching her thigh. "She wasn't diabetic. You think I don't know my own wife?" Teddy can only shrug at this. "Well, I guess I can only make you remember the things you want to be true." Teddy's account continues. Teddy already helped Leonard kill the real John G. and get his vengeance. Leonard even has a Polaroid picture of himself taken by Teddy, marking the occasion, an image of a smiling, bloodstained Leonard pointing at the spot on his bare chest where he will tattoo a permanent reminder, "I've done it." Leonard's refusal to believe Teddy's account is the catalyst for everything that follows. Leonard makes a deliberate choice to lie to himself, to make Teddy his new John G., and thus his new target in his quest for revenge, which sets off the remainder of the film's events, as this final scene is really the midpoint in the broader chronological narrative. And so in this way, the individual or personal memory of Leonard becomes prioritized over and against the social or collective memory of those around him. And thus Leonard's narrative identity becomes manipulated, which, as we will recall, Ricoeur named as a form of memory abuse. When we don't have a trusted community to tell us who we are and remind us of what is true, our narratives become lost and fragmented. So Nolan based the screenplay on an original story his brother Jonathan wrote. And Nolan structures Memento's narrative as a kind of parabola. He describes it as like a hairpin by decoupling the fabula of the narrative from the sujit. So Nolan unpacks the reasoning for this distinct structure in an interview where he explains how he wrote it. He wanted to get to the bottom of the subjective experience of somebody who experienced memory loss. That's one of the reasons we go to the movies, he said. This film, we didn't want to give a comfortable world. We didn't want to step outside of his head. We wanted to present the audience with the problem effectively and say, he can't ever get outside his head and recognize what objective truth is. And so I think the audience at the end of the film is left to make certain of the same judgments that he is. They're invited to believe or disbelieve certain elements of what's supposed to have happened. So scenes shot in color, what Nolan labels as subjective, are ordered backwards in time, whereas those shot in black and white, what Nolan labels as objective, are structured chronologically and move forward in time. And it's not just formal innovation for its own sake, but it's motivated by the experience of human subjectivity that Nolan is seeking to explore and convey. As film scholar David Bordwell explains, quote, by omitting what led up to what we're seeing now, Nolan's plot structure approximates the amnesiac character's lack of knowledge about what happened previously. So this makes Memento arguably the most difficult of Nolan's narratives to follow, rivaled only by Tenet. And if you've seen Tenet, you know what I mean. As both films have inspired viewers and critics alike to compose complex diagrams plotting out all the individual scenes and trying to get them in the correct order. What's remarkable then is actually how clear and followable the film is, a testament to Nolan's faith in the audience and their hermeneutical skills. So as I've suggested, Nolan displays a hopeful anthropology in presenting the film in this way, trusting that the viewer will not only be able to make sense of the story, but maybe even enjoy the process of discovering the narrative as it unfolds. Part 2. What is memory? Many metaphors have been used to provide an answer to this. It's like a wax tablet, a book, a library, a labyrinth, a storehouse, a computer, a hologram, a photograph, and of course, a film. In Paul Ricoeur's massive tome, Memory, History, Forgetting, the philosopher proposes a phenomenology of memory structured around two questions. Of what are their memories, and whose memory is it? So for Ricoeur, the move from the what question to the who question goes through a how question. How do we actually remember when we remember? What are we doing when we're remembering? And how is memory production intricately linked to both the object or event of memory, what we remember, as well as our subjective identity as remembering beings? So Ricoeur draws a phenomenological sketch of memory. And in his analysis, he attempts to decouple memory and imagination, noting that the function of imagination is directed towards the fantastic, the fictional, and the possible, while the function of memory is directed towards a previous reality, a historical event, a so-called fact. And yet, drawing on Henry Bergson, he eventually comes around to integrating the two as what he calls a memory image, stating, quote, it does appear the return of a memory can only take place in the mode of becoming an image, which is very cinematic. That is, the phenomenology of memory is a phenomenology of imagination, as memory and imagination still remain distinct in Ricoeur's understanding. So for Ricoeur, there's an ethical dimension underlying all this too, what Ricoeur calls being faithful to the past. Ultimately, just as memory and imagination are linked, the practice of remembering and recognition is a search for truth itself, though without necessarily objectively arriving. What Ricoeur calls the practice of faithfulness. So being faithful to the truth of the past. That is, we can truly rely on our memory while also recognizing the limits and pitfalls of memory. We can remain sincerely faithful to the past through the power of our imagination as individuals and communities through a kind of mental time travel. But this raises epistemological questions. How do we discern whether a memory is an accurate record of a historical event or just our own imagination, and perhaps a fiction, not unlike what seems to happen to Leonard in Memento? Ricoeur recognizes what he calls the pitfall of the imaginary, where putting into images borders on the hallucinatory, and a loss of reliability for memory as a practice. Basically, we can hallucinate our own memories. We can also experience or enact what Ricoeur calls memory abuse, where our memories are blocked or manipulated or forced. Regarding this second abuse, as we see with Leonard, or as we will see with Leonard in Memento, manipulation of memory has significant negative effects on a person's sense of self and identity. So Ricoeur describes this fragility of identity, which can be manipulated by political ideologies as well as traumatic violence. But despite these potential pitfalls and abuses, this constant danger of confusing our memory and our imagination, Ricoeur states, quote, "We have nothing better than memory to guarantee that something has taken place before we call to mind a memory of it." We are essentially remembering beings. So Ricoeur seems to prioritize the individual and personal memory over the social and collective for reasons which are made apparent. First, Ricoeur recognizes that the collective dimension is very large and nuanced. So the we of collective memory could be as close as intimate friends or family, or as far-reaching as entire nations, or even just the broad category of everyone. But the main reason why individual memory is so significant for Ricoeur, and even could be considered the culmination of his philosophical work, is that he contends as humans have narrative identities, these narratives are constructed through our individual memories, which serve as the building blocks of our self-understanding through self-narration. We understand our very selves as time-bound beings through self-narration of historical events and experiences. So again, human beings are remembering beings. Our memory making and our self are linked. Ricoeur's memory-established philosophical anthropology brings us to Saint Augustine and his own memory-established theological anthropology. So Paige Hochschild claims that for Augustine, quote, "Memory is at the heart of what it means to be constituted in the image of God. It declares a fundamental grounding of that which is changing in the unchanging. In this relation, Augustine finds the fulfillment of what it means to be human." So for Augustine, writing in Book 10 of De Trinitate, memory is one part of the triad that makes up the human mind. So memory, understanding, and will. Although the mind cannot be reduced to memory solely, says Paige Hochschild, memory is clearly the anthropological basis for a phenomenology of embodied life in Augustine's anthropology. And we also see this in Book 10 of Augustine's Confessions, where he claims that the faculty of memory, rather than our sense perceptions, give human beings the capacity to understand and know God. And Book 10 marks this really pivotal moment in Confessions, as Augustine shifts from confessing who he was in the historical past, i.e. narrating his own identity, to confessing who he is now, sharing with both God and his readers the abiding condition of the embodied soul and the particular problem of the divided will. So the problem Augustine faces is twofold, that of self-knowledge or the transcendence of truth, and then the inability of the human will to be conformed to the truth that transcends the human soul. So as we shall see, this is the exact problem that Leonard faces in Memento, and which Nolan claims the film is all about. How can we access objective truth as subjective people? The answer for Augustine is through the God-given faculty of memory, which is the mind's mode of apprehending truth. So in summary, the faculty of memory in Book 10 is not simply the way in which the soul retains and meaningfully assimilates present perception and past experiences. Memory is the embodied soul's mode of approaching God. Augustine ultimately goes on to claim that our minds and our memories and our very selves are actually all just one and the same. So for Augustine, we find ultimate happiness and communion with the transcendent God through our faculty of memory, precisely because our existence rests in the memory of God. And this is most fully realized in the incarnation of Christ, which is the perfect model of the unification of the temporal and the eternal, or the finite and the infinite, fully human, fully divine. In Augustine's theology, the incarnation and the Trinity are inseparable mysteries, the one a practical as well as a speculative access to the other. And why this all matters for Christopher Nolan is because Augustine is not proposing a kind of idealist or dualistic anthropology, but like Ricoeur and Nolan, but for reasons which are maybe obviously more Christian, Augustine's theological anthropology brings mind, which includes memory and body, together in perfect unity via the incarnate Son. The whole human person, so mind, body, and soul, finds its fulfillment in Christ through the grace of God. But what happens when our faculties of memory are broken or abused? Perhaps by a traumatic event or through the result of sin. For both Ricoeur and Augustine, this would entail the very loss of identity and selfhood, a loss of meaning and happiness, a loss of comprehension of God and the good. Furthermore, despite humanity's capacity for self-knowledge and divine knowledge via the faculty of memory, the human will often appears to be incapable of conforming to truth. We are just as capable of self-deception as we are of self-awareness. And it's this very tension, humanity's innate capacity for knowledge and self-understanding, which is inevitably thwarted by humanity's fallibility and self-delusion, which permeates all of Nolan's cinema, with Memento being the prime example. Indeed, just as film functions as the right metaphor for answering the question, what is memory, so Nolan's film, Memento, seeks to address this query via the cinematic form. So with Ricoeur and Augustine now fresh in our memories, we can focus our attention on Memento, Ricoeur's neo-noir film starring Guy Pearce as Leonard Shelby, a man suffering from short-term memory loss who is searching for his wife's killer. In the following presentation, I wish to consider the resonance between one of Christopher Nolan's earliest films, Memento, and one of philosopher Paul Ricoeur's later works, Memory, History, and Forgetting. As I note in my book on this subject, Ricoeur's broad interests mirror Nolan's, so time and narrative, metaphor and memory, and the fallibility and capability of the human self. Like Nolan, Ricoeur was especially interested in the phenomenology of time and memory, how we understand our world and ourselves through narratives, as well as the limits of that understanding. And while there have been numerous analyses of Memento from the perspectives of both film studies and philosophy, I want to suggest that further attention ought to be given to the potential religious or even theological themes that are discernible in Nolan's cinema, themes made more evident via Ricoeur's phenomenological hermeneutics. And so I have proposed that Nolan's is a kind of post-secular cinema. So post-secular cinema interrogates the apparent binaries between the sacred and the secular, the objective and subjective, the immanent and the transcendent. In an edited collection called Immanent Frames, John Caruana and Mark Cauchi describe post-secular cinema as, quote, the work of those filmmakers whose films explicitly hover over that gray zone that dissolves the strict boundaries that are often established between belief and unbelief, and they resist the seduction of certainty. Nolan's films are post-secular in that they raise questions and make proposals about human finitude, not only in philosophical terms, but also as a kind of theological anthropology, only without explicit reference to or reverence towards a particular organized religion. So in other words, I want to suggest that Nolan's cinema is exploring the fundamental questions addressed by theology only in indirect and outwardly non-religious ways, yet with a discernible preoccupation with the human experience of and yearning for the transcendent. And indeed, this is one area where Nolan and Ricoeur find resonance, not only in the content of their ideas, but in the formal limits that they place upon themselves in their respective disciplines. So throughout his lifetime, Ricoeur repeatedly resisted being called a theologian or a biblical scholar, despite writing numerous philosophical works about the Christian God, biblical hermeneutics, and the symbols of religion. So he spoke of not being a Christian philosopher, but rather a philosopher from a Christian heritage. He was very clear. He's a philosopher and not a theologian. And yet in his philosophical project, Ricoeur made it clear that it was possible and even necessary to address the question of God and transcendence when constructing a philosophical anthropology. So Ricoeur ultimately claims that God is needed if we're trying to understand who we are as human beings. And even though he won't go so far as to say that he's a theologian, I'd be okay calling him one. In Ricoeur's view, God is not just a philosophical concept, but this also doesn't mean philosophy cannot speak about God. Philosophy may speak about God as long as it does not attempt to import religious ideas given by revelation and then claim that these ideas can be proven philosophically. Ricoeur therefore agrees with Aquinas that philosophy can tell us that God is, but not what God is. As philosopher Pamela Sue Anderson puts it, for Ricoeur, quote, "A comprehensive philosophical anthropology is inevitably tied to theological reflection." So likewise, even as Nolan's films are obviously cinematic works and not very obviously religious, they're potentially theological works. The authors of Deep Focus, Film and Theology and Dialogue state this: Nolan's films routinely confront filmgoers with expressly theological questions. To say that Nolan's movies are theological is not to say that God makes any cameos. Indeed, God is noticeably absent from these narrative worlds. Nevertheless, at seemingly every turn, Nolan's films explore the fundamental nature of what it means to be human, how we relate to broader society, and what, if anything, exists beyond the horizon of our humanity. So Memento, like its predecessor following, and every Nolan film after it, explores the depths of human fallenness and depravity. One scholar has even claimed that Memento, quote, is the ultimate cinematic portrayal of original sin. So I want to suggest that all of Nolan's films, including Memento, should be considered works of post-secular philosophical theology. It's cinema actually doing philosophical and theological work, not just depicting it, or necessarily promoting or adhering to an orthodox religious tradition. So as I unpack this claim, I'm going to attempt to structure this presentation exploration of Memento akin to how Nolan structures his film, moving backwards, section by section, from the conclusion to the introduction, which you are hearing now. And this phenomenological approach invites you as the audience to rely upon your own memory in order to grasp the logic of the presented ideas, and to make you aware of both our own limits as human beings, as well as our innate yearning for a more objective or transcendent perspective, a God's eye view who can actually settle for us what is really real and really true beyond our subjective perspectives. So my ambitious endeavor here relies on a kind of trust, or maybe a better word is faith, in you as the audience, and the faith that you have to have in me as a presenter as we work backwards through this presentation, for you to follow the plot, as it will. So rather than just explain the phenomenology of comprehending Memento's narrative, which has been done before, I hope to have you kind of experience the phenomenon I'm trying to describe. And I want to follow in the legacy of Nolan and Ricoeur, who, despite their apparent skepticism about humanity's ethics and epistemology, nevertheless share a hopeful anthropology, what Ricoeur calls the capable self. That is, both Nolan and Ricoeur have faith in the human being, that our lives and actions have real meaning, that in spite of our limitations and frailties, we are still capable of doing good and making sense of our world, even if we don't always realize it or choose it. And what I ultimately hope to promote in this presentation are the apparent overlaps and intersections between film, philosophy, and theology, and thus demonstrate how an integration of these seemingly disparate disciplines might help us better appreciate post-secular filmmakers like Christopher Nolan. Now, where was I? Oh yeah, the real conclusion. Here we go. The broken storyline of Memento, as well as all of Nolan's other major films, simultaneously suggests both the incapacity of human beings to fully know themselves as having a coherent or stable identity, and assumes the intellectual capacity of the audience to not only follow the disjointed story, but to even find greater delight in putting together the puzzle pieces than if the story were presented straightforward in a traditional chronological whole. So in other words, even as Nolan's cinema presents a generally pessimistic anthropology diegetically, as in within the films, it also implies a more optimistic anthropology in and for its audience, what Paul Ricoeur calls the capable human being or the capable self. So for Ricoeur, the answer to the question, what does it mean to be a human, is not Descartes' cogito, like I think, but in capability, I can. The notion of human capability or the capable self can be considered a thematic thread which ties Ricoeur's philosophical anthropology all together and can be traced throughout his whole corpus. And yet, this homo capax is also fallible or limited or wounded. While being capable of much good, the human being is incapable of moral perfection or a fully integrated self. Memento's aesthetic structure and diegetic characters suggest just such a fractured humanity, a rift or fault in logical continuity and epistemological certainty. So in the world of Christopher Nolan, human beings are fallible beings. And yet, Nolan and Ricoeur seem to also recognize humanity's innate capacity for observation and interpretation and narrative construction. Even when presented with ostensibly disjointed story structures filled with twists and turns and lies and deception, the audience not only can understand the film, Nolan expects them to, and we enjoy it. We actually like being confused. So in an interview on the making of his very first film, Following, Nolan expresses these views about human capacity. And this is a fairly lengthy quote from Nolan. It's a process of expansion, a filling in of detail and making connections, not based on chronology, but on the particulars of the story. We, human beings, don't tend to have chronological conversations either. They go all over the place. That's very interesting to me. What I tried to do with Following was to tell a story in something like 3 dimensions. Instead of just expanding in one direction, it expands in every direction as you're passing through it. But I wanted my use of nonlinearity to be obvious to the audience in terms of plot payoff. I tried to make it more obvious why these things come together in a particular way. So notice how Nolan both expects the audience to make these connections and fill in details on their own, but he also feels this need to make it more obvious, lest we just get totally lost. And this is the capable and yet incapable, or what I would call the wounded yet capable self that's described by Ricoeur. I'm capable of following the plot, but being human, I will also get lost if things aren't made obvious to me by an all-knowing, transcendent director in control of the diegetic world. And indeed, perhaps we're all wounded yet capable selves navigating this world with our broken yet beautiful human wills, guided by a transcendent director and creator who redeems and restores and guides us, a director in whom we live and move and have our being. Thank you. Do we have time for questions?
We do, yes.
Cool.
Questions?
Questions or comments? Yeah, in the back.
What are your thoughts on the relation of memory with someone that doesn't have a mind's eye, that can't picture things, and also has no inner dialogue or narration?
Like in real life or in a film imagined world? I don't know that I would have a really clear answer to that if there's no imagination and no, what was the second part?
No, like running dialogue, or like it can be like shut off, or
Like no capacity for their own narration? Yeah. I mean, I would say they're still human beings. Maybe that needs to be said. But I think what Nolan is trying to explore here, and then what Ricoeur would say, is there's a distinct loss of something that they would be normally capable of in understanding themselves. It'd be like a loss of self without a loss of their humanity. And maybe there's a distinction there, selfhood and humanness, or the image of God within us. At least that's what I would believe as a Christian, with the image of God part. So that's an interesting question. And I feel like a psychologist would answer that better than a theologian would. So, other questions? Yeah.
Thank you very much. This was really compelling. I don't know if this is a question or a comment. Well, so one question I have is, this is like what you're doing with Memento. Like I can see it, and I'm sure that you address this in your book. But I'm wondering how you think about how this way of thinking maps onto, like, say, the Dark Knight trilogy or something like that? Because I'm sure that your book is probably, because you say the films of Christopher Nolan, so I'm assuming that it does. Another question is the use of the black and white color alternation in Oppenheimer, and if you think there's anything there. So I'll throw those out and let you.
Yeah, so the way that I've structured the book, and I focus mostly on Memento here because it's probably the key, I think the keystone to a lot of what Nolan's trying to do, and I think you could go back and see a lot of what Nolan was doing in this film and traces throughout. So the question of human subjectivity and yet this desire to like transcend that, to somehow get beyond that, and the kind of dimension between subjectivity and objectivity. The Dark Knight trilogy in my book, I explore the problem of evil and the depiction of evil, and basically how each of those three films maps onto what Ricoeur is to. Every book chapter maps onto something Ricoeur does, like one of Ricoeur's books. So Ricoeur has a work called The Symbolism of Evil, and so looking at the symbolism of evil and Batman and all of his villains, and how each of those villains metaphorically symbolizes perspectives on answering the question of where does evil come from. And then Augustine gets thrown in there too. So as I was working on this book, I mostly was starting with Ricoeur, and then I just kept coming back to Augustine over and over again. And then finally was like, I just need to include that in the rest of this because it makes sense. Yes, maybe. But yeah, so your second question, the objective and subjective, black and white, in Memento is similar to what's happening in Oppenheimer, where, and he's said this too in interviews, that like one of those is more subjective and one of them is more objective. One of them is supposed to be kind of the interiority of J. Robert Oppenheimer, and one is more externalized, and from kind of Robert Downey Jr.'s character's perspective, but also just the collective memory of others. So we get less of what's happening inside of his head in those scenes, and more of how others see him, where all the color scenes are, I mean, sometimes like as close to in his head as we can get without Nolan actually going inside and showing us like POV perspectives or things like that from him. So does that answer or address some of the questions?
Oh, yeah. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Other questions or comments or pushback? Here and then here.
I just have a really, I guess I just want to hear more about how you, I don't know if you talk this in your book. I'm just very curious about the functional role of tattoo play in the Memento, because I think tattoo is both like a symbol, but at the same time it's like kind of, it can be letters or it can be like images, and also it can be like a media form for like evoking like a memory. So I want to hear how you think about analyze the role of tattoo in the film.
Yeah, so his tattoo practice is his form of narration, where we typically will do our self-narration like even internally, or maybe sometimes externally through things like journaling, or maybe we do like a video blog now or something like that. It's very much a film of its time. If he was making this film today, he would just have a smartphone and he would record things, and he wouldn't write notes, and he wouldn't make tattoos, right? Because he would just take pictures and things like that. But he has to have a Polaroid camera, and he has tattoos. So there's these kind of narration of the tattoos, both image and words. It's mostly words, but there's a few images on there. And then the images of his Polaroid photos that he has to collect and hold on to, because his narrating faculties or capacities are broken, right? And I think there's something significant that photography and narration kind of, I mean, he's using cinema, or kind of this like, maybe the base elements of cinema, to be able to narrate his own life, to be able to understand it better. And again, if he had a phone where he could just take videos of things and remind himself of what's going on, he probably would. And I don't know if the film would be as interesting, actually. Like, it very much had to have happened in the year 2000, before smartphones and iPhones and all that kind of technology is out there. But yeah, I think it's a good question about what he's doing with that body tattooing as narration. Question in the back.
What kind of like pulled you into wanting to study this, and what were you most curious
Yeah, that's a good question. I did my PhD at the University of St Andrews in Scotland, and I did it on some filmmakers, the Dardenne brothers, who are German. They're Belgian filmmakers. They're brothers who've won the Cannes Film Festival multiple times. Anyone seen any Dardenne brothers movies or heard of them? No, they're very obscure in America. Have you seen any? Okay, good. They're wonderful filmmakers, but nobody's seen them in the States. And so I did a whole PhD on that, of integrating theology, philosophy, and film. And as I was doing that, I was like, nobody's heard of these guys. Who would be like the exact opposite of this? That maybe everybody's heard of, but also would fit into this kind of post-secular cinema, where exploring theological or religious questions and ideas, but are ostensibly secular. And Nolan came to mind, and he's a filmmaker that I've loved and admired for a long time, since I first saw Memento when I was in high school, and was just kind of blown away that could, like, a film could be done this way, this kind of backwards and forwards structure, and that I could actually follow it. I just thought it was amazing. And then I was like, maybe I could actually, find some theological resonance that's going on here, and then discovered that Nolan was raised Catholic, so has a Catholic background and upbringing, and he's very, very hesitant about talking about that in interviews, because I think he doesn't want to invite like a religious reading of his films. The Dardenne brothers, also raised Catholic, also would be very hesitant about bringing that up as like a reading or a lens on their films. But once you start to see this stuff, like, why does he put a Bible in this? Why does he use pipe organs from churches in Interstellar to communicate this kind of sense of transcendent awe and wonder? And specifically goes to a church that he was familiar with, that he's like, I want that particular sound to give this kind of sacred sense, even though he's also going to scientists to try to make sure that the black holes are, the quantum physics are all correct and things like that. So he's a really interesting filmmaker that way, that he's exploring these really deep questions, and he's like almost there in theology. And as a theologian, I'm like, oh, you're so close. I just want to kind of pull you in a little bit further. And I kind of dance around in this world of theology and philosophy and film, where I identify as a theologian, I guess, but I'm also, like, I teach film students at my university. I'm teaching a film theory and criticism course right now, and then I dabble in philosophy, and like Ricoeur was kind of my main go-to person in my PhD. So all that to say, a long answer to your question, a lot of this is just kind of my own wrestling with how do these three worlds of theology, philosophy, and film, how do they integrate, and where are their connecting points? And who are filmmakers that are exploring all three? And Nolan seemed to be one that people would have heard of before. And so that's why I picked him. So, yeah.
So kind of bouncing off what he said, with regards to the significance of the tattoos, what came to mind for me, and I kind of wanted to get your thoughts on this, is that the tattoos can be seen as a symbol in a way of replacing the immaterial memory with the material. So in that same way, when we replace a sense of identity and a sense of self that we attain through the transcendent with a sense of identity attained via material things, we're left sort of totally lost without that.
Taking the transcendent and turning it into the immanent through the tattoo?
The transcendent and turn to the material for a sense of identity and a sense of self. That he is sort of doing the same, not really through his own choice, through his disability here. And in that same way, when we turn from the transcendent to the material for our sense of identity, we're left with, it's insufficient for filling the same role. And our sense of self is completely is not on a solid ground there.
I guess I'd want to say, if I'm understanding you correctly, I think I would maybe push back a little bit on the idea that like the transcendent and immanent are so separate. And I think with, again, Augustine and the Incarnation, where we've got like the transcendent God and then the immanence of humanity combined somehow in this kind of mystery of the hypostatic union and the Son, the second person of the Trinity, that materiality doesn't necessarily equal non-transcendent anymore, or anti-transcendent, that there is maybe more of an integration there that can actually happen. That's, again, me as a theologian answering that question.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with Augustine at all, so I was, that's why I wanted to ask.
Yeah, so I think Augustine would certainly be like, yeah, there's a brokenness to the material world, to put it mildly, because of sin, and he's got a lot to say about that. But because of who the Son is, as in Jesus Christ the Son, that immanence and transcendence, that materiality is actually redeemed and restored because of the incarnation and what Christ has done, and then ultimately through the crucifixion, resurrection, and ascension. So that gets much more theological than philosophical in that answer, but I hope that helps address some of, your inquiry there. Yeah.
So we'll just go back to the body tattoos. So you say, well, films made in today's times would have smartphones and stuff being used. And I just wondered about, would the tattoos still be of some significance? So it seems that with the markings, putting the tattoos on is also, having them on his body is also trying to connect to bodily continuity, but also capturing that he's a person that's embodied as well. So maybe I wonder whether, if the movie was made today, the tattoos would still be there. Nolan would still have them in. Maybe the Polaroid would not. It'd be a different piece of technology with the Polaroid, perhaps, but the tattoos would still still stay. And again, for that reason. And do you think that the tattoos are more important than the Polaroids in the movie?
I think they're important in the sense, and maybe to jump off of this question too, like the Polaroids, and even again my phone, is like a disembodied technology that I have, that I've kind of like outsourced my memory to this, right? So I don't even remember people's phone numbers anymore. They're just in here, and I've used a piece of technology to be able to do that. The tattooing is still a bodily, it's still carnate, like it's still part of my body, right? And yet also not part of my body because I'm adding something to it or using scarring and ink and things like that to change my body on some level, while also still trying to have some bodily continuity. So his mind and his self has changed, right? And therefore he can't narrate his own understanding of who he is and can't continue to remember who he is. So he doesn't actually he has like a totally fractured self that can never actually be healed or restored unless he had, again, tattoos to remind him, or community. This is a part where I think the film is showing just how isolated and alone he is. There's an amazing story, and I'm going to just summarize the whole thing, about there was a pastor who actually experienced a similar kind of anterograde amnesia like this. And his community of his church kind of welcomed him back in as just a regular guy, not their pastor, and just kind of helped rehabituate him into, like he had to relearn his own, like his wife and his kids and all these other things. And eventually, like he kind of finds himself again, anew, in this community, and even eventually becomes a pastor again, like relearning his vocation. The difference there in what Leonard has is Leonard has no community. And even the tattooing is like just done by some stranger or some random, or himself. He's tattooing himself. So that sense of isolation, like even his own body, he has that, and that's all he's got. And that's maybe the best that he can get, because he's lost that kind of continuity with the wider social memory of people reminding him of who he is, since everybody around him is just manipulating him. But there is something interesting about the tattoos being integrated with the body, or somehow more connected than a disembodied technology like a Polaroid or a cell phone. And yeah, I wonder if there's something connected there too about just materiality and embodiedness, and maybe the mind-body problem. I don't know. To go philosophical there for a second.
Joel, on that, if I can follow up.
Yeah.
Isn't there something, as you said, he manipulates or alters his own body, and there's a sense in which it's his own, but the strange thing is he alienates his body because the tattoos are messages that he doesn't understand, right? So
Yeah.
So this is a very strange irony, I suppose we could say, that he tattoos the messages to remember, and he, unlike you said, unlike a phone where you would expect there's a sense in which it's physically alien, it's not part of me. Well, he's tattooing these messages on himself, but they become alienated messages because
Yeah.
he doesn't even know what they mean.
So there's something, yeah, actually there's something about this too, that tattooing, I'm going to say this, and I don't know if I even believe it, but I'm going to say it anyway. I think tattooing would be more subjective than this as a photograph would be more objective. Like if I take a picture of you, that's a picture of you, and I've got that, and the cinematic apparatus has taken a photo, and now we can kind of hold on to that in time. A tattoo, I can decide what is going to be put on there, including facts that aren't actually facts.
Right.
Like one of the facts is the license plate number for John G., who's Teddy's license plate number. And that's something he gets tattooed on him as like a reminder of a fact, even though that's a lie. Like that's something that he's done to manipulate. Can photographs lie? Yes. Can we manipulate them, especially in, again, a world of like, I don't know, deep fakes and AI and all that stuff nowadays. It's definitely not as objective, and it never really was. But it may have a little bit closer sense to like kind of objective reality if I take a photo rather than if I wrote something down personally in a journal or wrote something on my body using a tattoo. That there's more objectivity to the technological side of this with cinema than there might be with the writing. I don't know if I think what I think about that yet, even as I'm saying it.
Well, yeah, I feel the same kind of ambivalence you do, because I wanted to say there's something about a written message, whether it's on your body or, like you said, if you wrote a journal, because you can lie, and as you pointed out, you can make images lie, but it seems like that, at least if we set aside just wholly AI generated images, if we set that aside, there is an objectivity to images that whether you write a message on your own body or in a journal, it's infected, I suppose we might say, from the start with the potential for memory abuse, your term. So
Yeah.
if I remember right in the film, isn't it that Leonard's become sufficiently irritated with Teddy that he knows when he's having the tattoo done, this is not really John G's license plate, but I'm going to have it put on me anyway? So there's a sense in which he's knowingly deceiving himself, isn't that correct?
He's knowingly deceiving himself by writing down who John G., like, don't believe his lies with Teddy, and destroying the evidence, 2 photographs, evidence that he killed Jimmy and that he's already killed John G., the photo of him pointing to his chest. I don't know that he remembers at that point in the film when he's getting the tattoo of the license plate numbers or other facts.
No, the moment when he decides, I'm going to deceive myself. Isn't that correct?
Yes, he does know that, and he's willfully.
I'm going to intentionally and purposely deceive myself, knowing these artifacts that I use to try to remind myself of what's true. I'm going to distort them on purpose.
So it's his own kind of self-narration.
Yeah.
And he knows it's wrong,
Right.
both like morally and even just kind of like reality-wise, like it's not real. And yet, this is where I think Ricoeur would also be like, but there's something about that that's almost good in this longing for, I'm trying to narrate myself or trying to come up with some kind of meaning, and even the fact that I have a capacity to try to do that, even if it's flawed, and ultimately I'm deceiving myself in going about this. Ricoeur would kind of take that a couple steps back and like, but you can do it, and that that's not nothing. That's something about being human that I even have the capacity to do that. That's kind of significant and unique about being a human, that I could even choose my own trajectory on some level. The problem becomes, and this is where Ricoeur starts and where Nolan starts too, is why do we do that? Like, why do human beings, and we've all done this on some level, like, why do we choose the bad instead of the good, or lie to ourselves, or I know this is a bad idea, you know, to eat this or drink this or say this or whatever, and then I do it anyway. And that's like a whole thing in Nolan's cinema, is this question of like, why do people make mistakes and then willfully make those mistakes? Why do they lie to themselves? I call it the Nolan lie in the book, kind of like the noble lie of Plato. But it's this question of people lie in every one of Nolan's films. Like, that's kind of a main thing that happens, a central motif. Somebody is going to tell a lie, and they'll not only get away with it, but it'll somehow lead to something in the story that's usually good, except for in this case, where it leads to just complete self-destruction. So, yeah.
And I hadn't thought of this until now, but I wonder if that colors the way that we think about the fact that Leonard has redacted the files.
Yes.
According to Teddy's narrative.
Yeah.
He has redacted the files. If he might have done that in a moment of lucidity to give himself the puzzle that gave purpose to his life, which is the pursuit of this assailant.
Yeah, because what would he do once he actually found this person? What would be the purpose and meaning of his life after that? If his final memory is of his wife dying, which may not actually be true anyway, but it's really this traumatic experience that he was responsible for killing his own wife. And that's the thing that he's trying to forget. So it's a really sad film in that sense, right? Like, it's really dark. Here's a person who's undergone trauma and then also now enacted trauma on his wife and killed her, and now he's basically a serial killer, right? That he's turned himself into one, and that's his purpose in life. Which is, again, very pessimistic anthropology, right? Like, this is what human beings are. And yet, Nolan's assumption that we will get it, like we'll follow the clues and understand what's going on, I think is a really optimistic anthropology. Like, he has a high regard for audiences, especially for like a Hollywood blockbuster kind of filmmaker, where it's usually the lowest common denominator kind of thing, right? And whatever's going to make money. And he somehow has the capacity to be like, no, I'm not going to use CGI. We're all going to use all these practical effects, and you're going to have to now buy these new IMAX projectors that are 70 millimeters so you can show Oppenheimer, and it's going to be a 3-hour movie about people sitting around talking in a room, and that's it. That's really what Oppenheimer is like a 3-hour movie with people just chatting, and then a bomb blows up, right? And it's like engaging and riveting and thrilling because it's these kinds of questions about what does it mean to be really human, and the capacity for human good. Again, like maybe one of the greatest scientific achievements in the 20th century, entering into the atomic age. So very optimistic. And also maybe the worst thing that we could have done as human beings, to even to create a weapon that we could actually annihilate ourselves and maybe the rest of creation. So that kind of the polarizing of like very optimistic and very pessimistic are kind of wrapped up together in Nolan's cinema. And that's where that wounded yet capable self. And Oppenheimer is a great example of that, of somebody who, again, achieves this amazing scientific feat and then realizes, even as he's doing it, just the moral, depravity that he's kind of participated in, right? That he's actually enacted something that might be the worst possible thing for humans to do.
Joel, I have another question. I want to point and draw attention to your method of presentation, which you said it purposely mimics Nolan. You said Nolan has faith in the viewer's hermeneutic skills. Well, you replicated that by suggesting that you would give us a presentation that demanded faith in our hermeneutic skills, that we had to figure out how to make sense of this presentation. I want to, you're a theologian, I want to draw out a particular theological, and at the end you did this, right? You said that maybe we can see the directors, someone like Nolan, or you giving a presentation as an image of a divine creator, which is really bizarre, because on one level you're suggesting that God purposely makes interpreting the world difficult for us. Now I want to play two things off, and I'm curious what you would say about this. Paul famously says in Romans 1, 18, 19, 20, he says that God's revealed himself through nature, and in fact everything that we need to know about God's nature is revealed through the things he's made. So a very, we might say, a robust faith-reason integration kind of statement. Then you've got Jesus in, if I'm remembering correctly, Matthew 13, when the disciples ask him, why do you teach in parables?
Oh.
And he says, because I don't want people to understand what I'm saying.
Yeah.
He famously quotes Isaiah, right, where Isaiah says,
Yeah.
I speak so they won't hear, and
It's Isaiah's call.
Yeah. So, I mean, what do we make of this, that God, God assumes or has faith in our hermeneutic skills. In fact, we could say God creates human beings as having, if you're a theist, right, you would believe this, God creates human beings as having these robust hermeneutic skills, but he purposely makes it hard for us to understand, right? So we have this claim of Paul in Romans 1 that it's there, it's obvious, you can see it. Of course, Paul effaces that claim almost immediately by saying, in sin we say we don't want to know, we refuse to understand. And then you've got Jesus saying this, making this claim about parables, that he purposely teaches in a enigmatic way in order to ensure that only those who are hermeneutes, I guess we would say, right? If you're not a hermeneut, you're not going to understand what God's doing. What do you think about all this?
Oh man, a lot of things. I'll give kind of two responses. One is a cinema-based one. So in Conclave, and I know I'm at a Catholic university, I don't know how you all felt about Conclave. I really enjoyed it. The sermon that Ray Fiennes' character gives about the ultimate sin is the sin of certainty, right? That certainty has led to all kinds of terrible things in kind of the realm of faith. And I think there's something to that the absolute certainty, if everything was abundantly clear, then faith really wouldn't even be a virtue anymore. It would just be this kind of absolute knowledge that we seem to have, and there wouldn't be a level of trust and a level of needing other people in community to have kind of like a hermeneutical interpreters, fellow interpreters that were, did you see what I see? Did you hear what I hear? How are we figuring this out together? That I think is also related to us being as kind of narrating creatures and remembering creatures, and those things seem to be related to. That God seems to be a God, at least the Christian God seems to present as a storytelling and story creating God. Even Jesus is telling all kinds of stories in parables, and then inviting people to try to make interpretations about those stories. And Scripture itself is this kind of large overarching narrative. And there's so much story in poetry as opposed to like commands or prose discord or really clear law commands, right? And even those require interpretation on our part to understand what those commands are. So it seems like God enjoys that and makes us to enjoy it too. Like we like this kind of stuff. And maybe you were annoyed by the presentation being like, he's doing this backwards and that's a cheesy gimmick and it didn't work. I don't know. Or maybe it was like, oh, that's really clever and interesting, and I've never seen a presentation done like that before. Way to go, Joel. But like that, it's something that is kind of like engaging or intriguing or like piques our interest, right? And we want to figure these things out and kind of lean in closer. And I think the parables are like that. And the Dardenne brothers, I write about their films as being parables. They're like these indirect ways of doing theology through narrative. So the parables like rarely ever speak about God. overtly. But we would say they're rich with theology. They're from the mouth of God. They're from Christ. And yet they rarely are like, here's exactly what I meant by this, and here's how this applies to your life in 3 easy steps. It's almost like to be more fully human is to kind of lean in and do this interpretive work, and again, do it in community together, and not just in isolation. And my final thought on this is I heard a sermon recently about the temptations of Christ in the wilderness, and the person presenting it presented one of the temptations in a way that I'd never thought of before, and it relates to this conclave quote. So the devil takes Jesus up to the temple and says, fling yourself off, because Scripture says that the angels will catch you, right? Because God has promised that he won't let harm fall to you. And Christ rejects this. And when I initially read that, I read it as like, well, of course, like he's not going to follow the devil and all that, and he's not going to do some big spectacle. But the person presenting this sermon said the temptation is not so much about being spectacular, but about absolutely proving that he was God in a public sort of way. That everyone would know for certain Jesus is God now, if like a bunch of angels just showed up and like did this and made it abundantly clear. And Jesus is like, no, I'm not going to do the certain thing. We're going to do the parable thing, this indirect storytelling. And I'm not going to do it in this nice, convenient way where if he came in the 21st century and again had a phone, he could communicate his message so much more effectively than just a ragtag group of 12 disciples that are just kind of wandering around in the ancient Near Eastern context. But he doesn't do that, right? He chooses this indirect way, and this way that seems to require faith instead of absolute certainty. That God seems to enjoy faith more than clarity, even as we have this eschatological promise again in 1 Corinthians of like, now I only see in part, and then I will fully see, and now I will be fully known. So there is a hope for that. But even then, I think there'll still be more to learn. I don't know. That's my own view of the eschaton. So that's a long answer to your question, but I hope it.
Maybe 2 more questions?
If anyone else, yeah, please.
Okay.
Yeah.
So for a while, I've been sitting here kind of grappling like an Aristotelian concept of essence versus accident, and kind of how it relates to your presentation. And I was just curious to get your thoughts on like, what do you think is the essence of a human being? Because you talked a lot about the integration of mind and body creating memories. And so like, is that kind of where you're leaning towards, that like the essence of the human experience is memory?
So again, I'm a theologian, so I'm going to answer it as a theologian. And I'd say the essence in this case, again, is Christ. That if I want to know what a human being is, and I actually look to Christ in the incarnation, and then that gives me my essential definition. And that might be punting from a philosophical answer to a more theological answer. Ricoeur would say, I'll just put it more Ricoeurian, that memory and narrating and, again, interpreting or being a hermeneut is kind of this essential part of what it means to be human. And so that earlier question, and now she's gone, but the earlier question of somebody who couldn't do that, like couldn't imagine or couldn't narrate, I still think they're human. So, and I think Ricoeur would say they're still human. I'm thinking of somebody who might be like comatose, or we can't see signs of those types of things happen or evidence of those things happen on an external level. But Ricoeur would still say they're human, and maybe that's where Ricoeur jumps into his own theological. He's a Christian, so he might go to there too and not be able just to answer it from a strictly philosophical perspective. I don't know if that answers your question.
That's good.
Okay.
I'm curious, this is more from a psychological direction.
Okay.
I think you've talked around it, but I wanted to hear a little more around agency. So I'm actually really enjoying the dialogue related to the tattoos, the role of tattooing, and I'm thinking of this as, and I haven't seen a movie, so I'm
Okay.
confession. But what is this person doing to help him either stay in the world or try to have some agency? Like, I think of a tattoo as very, that's, I'm assuming these were voluntary tattoos. He's choosing this.
Yes.
He's choosing to maybe, tattoo the wrong license plate, but there's a reason. So it's more the, I'd love to hear some response around
Yeah.
characters, that the agency, the choices he's making, and it may be, okay, this is how I connect with the world or feel like I have some humanity.
As a character, he has agency, but only for like short periods of time. And then he almost has a loss of agency in his loss of memory. It's like waking up is the way that he describes it. And there's moments in the film where there's actually a lot of funny moments. There's a moment where he's like running, and there's a guy like running over to the side, and he's narrating, and he's like, oh, I guess I'm chasing this guy. And so he goes and he runs after him, and then the guy pulls a gun and he's shooting. Oh no, he's chasing me. Like, he's waking up mid-moment. And so he has the agency to run and to choose to chase, but he's also unaware that he's all like there's wider circumstances. Yeah, he has no idea why he's doing that. He doesn't know who that person is. He doesn't even know the relation of the chase, right? Like, he thinks he's chasing when he wakes up, and then he realizes. So later on, he falls asleep in this guy who's chasing him in a hotel room, and wakes up and thinks it's his own hotel room. So he like takes a shower, and then this guy comes back into his hotel room, and then he thinks he's, somebody's invading my hotel room kind of thing. No, he's actually the invader who's gone into this other guy's room and taken a shower and doesn't remember any of it. So the question of agency and memory is a difficult one, because if you can't remember what you're doing, can you be held accountable for the actions that you're doing, especially if they're harmful to others, like killing people? Yes, like, we should hold people accountable for doing that, and there should be some sort of, they have enough agency that they're able to do harm to themselves and to others. The flip side, though, is what good can be done. Like, are they still capable of doing good in the world? And I hope so. The film doesn't depict that, which is tragic. So I just wonder, like, again, in the real world, that story of the pastor who is kind of rehabilitated into the life of his community, even he still has like a full loss of his memories, but he just kind of relearns who he is through the narration of others. Makes me think that agency is possible, or more possible, through that kind of communal healing.
Borrowing it.
Yeah. And people are like kind of bestowing or granting him, or like coming alongside and helping him with that. So what Nolan shows here with Leonard's character is, again, just somebody who's so isolated, and really self-isolated in many ways, that any kind of agency he has is kind of a false agency. He thinks he knows what he's doing, but he just, he's kind of flailing. And then waking up and flailing again. So, do you have time for any more?
Vern, you had a quote. We'll let you closing question here. Go ahead.
I don't know if this is a question, and I'm not doing the conference. This is really more of a comment, but
it's a conversation. We'll have a conversation.
Yeah. Well, so that line at the end where he says we all need mirrors to remind ourselves who we are. That the first time I saw this, I thought that's a weird. It's a weird thing to come right there, because it didn't seem to me at the time that mirrors played a hughtely prominent role in the film.
They do.
Except for the fact that the one tattoo that identifies who he is.
You can barely see it at the top.
is the one tattoo that I think that is in reverse order, so
Yep.
that it will be shown in the mirror. And then it's struck me that if you think about you think about what a mirror does. A mirror is equidistant between subject and object. The subject is looking at itself, and it is also the object. It is the subject and the object. And so you think about how the film ends, and the moment of revelation comes not at the beginning or at the end, but in the middle.
Yeah.
You know, we get to the end of the film.
Chronologically, it's the middle.
Is the middle.
Yeah.
Right? And that's when it all comes together and it all makes sense. And so the film itself acts in a way, kind of, you use the hairpin metaphor, which is what he uses, but it functions as kind of like a mirror. And this, you know, the thing about memory is that we very often think about it as like, oh, I'm going deep into the self, I'm going deeper into interiority, whereas for him, it's this process of transcendence.
Yes.
And so the film itself, and the way that you've characterized it as this sort of dialectic, if I could use that word, between the film itself and then the viewers who are making it make sense.
Yeah.
Right? The film itself acts as this kind of interplay of transcendence and meaning making, or something like that. So yeah, it's not really a question, just
Yeah. No, I think you're onto something with the mirror thing. With both within the film, the diegetic world, like mirrors are popping up all the time, and that mirrored image, he sees that multiple times, and kind of comes to recognize, almost remember, that's part of who I am, or that is who I am, is this person who's now seeking vengeance. But cinema itself, and there's a whole lot in film theory about this, about cinema acting as a mirror for us, as we're subjects watching the screen and projecting ourselves onto it, but also it's like responding to us. And even this film in particular, Memento, but really all of Nolan's films, are inviting us to like use our, again, meaning-making capacities and our memory capacities and all those other narration faculties, and put them to good use to construct the film as we're going along, and to almost see ourselves as we're doing this, like as these meaning-making beings or creatures that have that capacity. So we do that in Dunkirk, where there's like 3 different timelines that are happening. Same thing with The Prestige. There are multiple timelines that are going on, and they're all disjointed and out of order. And then Oppenheimer too, there's the black and white images, and then the color images, and the relationship between the two. And all those films are just inviting us to like, can I make sense of this? As a human being. So he's mirroring humanity's capacities to us through the cinematic apparatus, which is this, again, I think that's why it's so philosophically and theologically rich. It's not just for our own entertainment, it's actually helping us to recognize our own capacities and put them to good use. And then also showing us these really interesting stories that are drawing out these kinds of questions about what does it mean to be a human being? And what does it mean to be a remembering being, a time-bound being, a narrating being, in particular with these stories, like Memento and Oppenheimer, but really all of them, like all of Nolan's films do this. So it does, there's this like mirroring effect that's happening where we're seeing ourselves, not like in a projecting, like as if I'm Leonard, but that the film is like inviting me and bouncing back kind of this narration that I have to kind of put together myself in my own mind. Maybe like a broken mirror, and I'm putting the images back together and constructing it the way it should be seen. Yeah, I don't know if it's a good thought.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It's very, very interesting.
Let's thank our speaker.
Cool, yeah, thank you. Thanks.
Thanks very much. Hope I'll see you tomorrow night and again Friday night. Thanks for coming.